Look at Mark chapter 14, verses 22 through 25. You can see in the ESV, the institution of the Lord's Supper is the heading for this short paragraph. Let me read it to you. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." We see here at one of the most important pivotal moments in all of redemptive history, the institution of the Lord's Supper, as Jesus is facing the cross, soon to die, and then to be raised again, that he mentions, of all things, the covenant. John T. Rhodes points out in his book, one of the assigned texts for the class, he says most people can read this sentence, and in fact do read this sentence, as if that word, covenant, were not there. In fact, he says, if you just put your finger over the word and were to read the text, to most Christians, and Jesus says, "This is my blood, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink of it," etc., that if you take out the word covenant, it hardly means anything different in most people's ears. Now, you could say because everyone in your church is so sophisticated, they would hear the reference to blood and they would immediately think of the blood on the altar and they would already be thinking of covenant. So maybe your people are like that. But most people read that sentence as if the word covenant isn't even there, especially if you've been around a church a long time and maybe the minister says these words at some point, the blood of the covenant. Just sort of rolls off the tongue and you don't think much of it. What difference does it make that Jesus describes his soon-to-be act of sacrifice and this ritual meal as the blood of the covenant? What is so important about this covenant idea that at this peak moment in his life and ministry, he would want to say something about covenant? Well, that's what this class is about. Whether you come from a tradition where there are lots of covenants all around, sometimes people who are new to Christ's covenant, that's where I pastor, sort of say, okay, we get it. There's covenant groups, and there's covenant membership, and you baptize covenant children, and it's Christ's Covenant Church. All right, I get it. You have covenant college. Yeah, it's all very important. Others of you perhaps come from a church tradition where you've heard the language, but it has not been front and center or central in your understanding of the Bible. This passage mentions covenant. And for what reason? Well, in one sense, this whole class is about trying to fill out what it means and why Jesus would talk about covenant. But let me just show you one aspect of it, and I talk a little bit about this, I think, in my ecclesiology and sacraments class. This class, of course, talking about covenant theology, does have some overlap with sacraments, and we'll touch on that in a roundabout way at several points in the class. And I imagine there are some of you here, good Baptist friends, and you have people who are praying that this class will finally push you over to the edge into Presbyterianism. And there are others of you have people praying, I'm sending you to RTS, but just don't come out mixed up on this issue. So I was listening to the podcast today, Thinking in Public with Al Mohler. He was interviewing Carl Trueman. It's a good podcast if you're driving. He's talking about Carl's new book on creeds and confessions, and they're talking about the Westminster Confession, and Al says about the Second London Baptist Confession, thank you, Presbyterians, glad we could steal that and fix it for you. So we will talk about some of the differences and some of the overlap in understandings of the covenant. But let me show you something here in Mark's Gospel. Perhaps if you've had a gospel course here, you have learned that Mark's Gospel in particular is well known for these Markan sandwiches. By that I mean a number of different places, 5 or 6 in the Gospel of Mark, where quite deliberately you have A, B, A prime. That is, you have one theme, and then the theme revisited, and then in the middle is the meat. So it's a sandwich. You got a bun, you got meat in the middle. So for example, if you turn back to chapter 11, you can see this one very obviously. You see at the heading above verse 12, Jesus curses the fig tree. And then over verse 15, Jesus cleanses the temple. And then over verse 20, the lesson from the withered fig tree. This is an obvious Markan sandwich where the meat is in the middle. So Jesus curses the fig tree, and then on the backside, he explains why he has cursed the fig tree, because it isn't bearing fruit. And then in the middle, he cleanses the temple. Why? Because that is the literal enactment of what he just did symbolically with the fig tree. That the temple is representative of this religion in the first century that, according to Jesus, is not bearing the fruit that it should bear. And so it's the center of its religion there in the temple. Jesus cleanses it. That's to show the meaning. Why does he curse the fig tree? He explains it in the middle. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a religion of Judaism that is not bearing fruit as it should. So that's one Markan sandwich. Go back to chapter 14. So here we have one. Notice around this passage, instituting the Lord's Supper, there are two different predictions. Verse 17, when it was evening, came with the 12, they were reclining at table and eating. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, who is eating with me." They began to be sorrowful, say to one another, "Is it I?" He said, "It is one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with me." So here is his prediction of Judas' betrayal. Now, notice after the institution of the Lord's Supper, verse 26, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' Peter said, 'Even though they will all fall away, I will not.' Jesus said to him, 'Truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Sandwich. First, he predicts Judas will betray me. After, he predicts that Peter will deny him. Now, Judas will end his life in ignominy, and Peter will be reinstated. But here he's predicting betrayal and denial. And in the middle, here's the Markan sandwich. In the middle is the institution of the Lord's Supper. Why? Because this picture of Jesus at the Lord's Supper is the covenant-keeping Messiah in the midst of covenant betrayal. That's what this sandwich is showing us. You have Judas, a covenant betrayer. You have Peter, who is going to be a covenant betrayer. Both of them represent the covenant-breaking spirit here, even at the heart of the apostolic band. But in the middle of this sandwich, then, highlighted for us is Jesus, because he is the covenant-keeping Messiah in the midst of covenant betrayal. Just one of the reasons that it's significant that he describes this act as the blood, my blood, of the covenant. Here I am, Jesus says, I am fulfilling what has been promised and predicted and administered throughout redemptive history, and as I'll argue in the class, in eternity past. I am fulfilling here in this supreme act of my sacrifice the promissory note of the covenant administration. I am the one who will keep the covenant, these promises that have held you together even when you were full of covenant betrayal. I will keep this covenant. That's, in one sense, the very heart of the gospel, and it helps us make sense of what Jesus is doing here in the upper room. He is the covenant-keeping Messiah in the midst of covenant betrayal. So what we're going to do today in this first lecture is give a number of introductory comments about covenant, the centrality of the covenant, some of the terms and words and definitions of the covenant, and then look at some history of covenant theology. That's where we're going over these 2 hours. I will give you a break about halfway through. So, to whet your appetite, there you go, a little pericope, and just a word to the wise, never say that word outside of the walls of the seminary. You never have to say it when you're preaching or teaching a lesson. Ladies in our Bible study, please turn to the pericope. That's just a good seminary word. So, that's to get us oriented to this covenant idea. So look with me now. We have to do some basic introduction. Look at the syllabus. Want to make sure you know what we're doing. You can see the contact information. If you don't have it in front of you, I trust you've seen it, and you can pull it up online because I know you don't have your computers. But there's a midterm exam. There's a final exam. Ask someone who has had one of my courses before, and they will tell you what these exams are like. They're largely wanting you to retrieve knowledge and information. I'm not trying to trip you up. Things that go on the board are often important things to learn. Everything in the midterm or the final will be something that I have talked about in the class. So your reading, of course, is going to help you on those exams, but it will be only things that I've talked about in the class. So that's what you want to pay attention to for those exams. They will be some basic knowledge questions and then maybe very short answer, just kind of bullet point. I'm not looking on those exams for you to fill up blue books or write essays, but just have you been listening? Have you been paying attention? So we have 2 of those. I keep my course requirements very simple. Required reading, research paper. I want you to read with reasonable care. That means I don't want you to skim. It also means if you're reading a harder book like Turretin and you get by a paragraph and you think, I'm not sure I got all that, that's okay. You can keep going. I know you have a lot of reading to do, but with reasonable care. And I don't want you to listen to the books on Audible. I don't know if any of these books are on Audible or other audio. I listen to books on Audible. It's a great thing to do, but for a graduate level class, just a different kind of, you learn in a different way when you're able to have the input coming through more than just your ears as you're doing the dishes. If you've read one of these books before in another class, you can talk to me about that. Research paper, 35% of the grade. You can see all of the specifics there. Again, you can ask somebody who has had me for a course before if you haven't. I usually am grading on a few points for your format. Did you follow these instructions? You would be amazed, or perhaps you would not, that only a very small minority of students, you will be the exception, I'm sure, follow these instructions as they're laid out so wonderfully and clearly here with margins and fonts and all the rest. So pay attention to that. That's a few points. And then I will grade you on your research. Do you show evidence of doing graduate level research, that you have appropriate number of sources, a variety of sources? In particular, if you're arguing against something or someone, it's okay. You can write a paper where you don't agree with what I've said in the class. That's okay. I don't grade you down for not agreeing with what I'm saying in the class if you have a different take. But I will grade people down if you are not giving your intellectual opponents, whether I agree with them or not, a fair handling. So you want to show that you've done good research to understand the arguments you're making and the arguments you're critiquing. Do not go over the word limit. I do not want you to write more than that. I will not read past that. I may not accept your paper if it is past that. In the paper, 3,500 to 4,000 words. If you're at 3,350 words, don't fluff up 150 words. It's okay. It's a ballpark, and if you can say what you need to say and you have a couple hundred words left, that's all right. I do not want you to go longer. One of the things in life and ministry is to deal with constraints of time and space. So you may think it's a great idea, and I would really be impressed to read your 8,000 word or 20,000 word manuscript, but I would not. So there are several paper topics. You are not limited to these paper topics. In fact, I would enjoy it if you didn't all write on the same 3 or 4 things. You don't have to clear your paper topic with me, but it's a good idea. You could do it during a class break some week or after class. Sometimes we'll have to scoot right away, but you can do it one of those times, or you can send me an email. If you aren't sure as you start working on this weeks from now, months from now, by all means, just check with me, because it's easy to say, does this look like a good topic? How would you shape it differently, rather than turn in a paper and find out that wasn't a very good topic. But you can roll the dice, because we're Calvinists and we don't believe in luck. So you can do what you want, but by all means, feel free. Also, I want you to do a good job on this paper. I think there are more important things than getting a good grade in this class. Easy for me to say. I already finished all my grades in all my classes. But you're here to do a good job. I assume you want to be here. I remember when I was in seminary, one of the great speeches, I won't repeat it all, that one of my professors gave me was just about your whole life. Some of you have families, you have kids, you're about to have kids right now. Okay, didn't come yet. You are going to have sickness, you're going to have things come up. So this class is important. Your grade matters to you. It's not the most important thing in the whole world. So keep in mind what sort of Christian you're trying to be, and I will try to grade your paper as fairly as I can. I will grade for writing. I know every professor has a little different philosophy on this, but with the papers, I am looking that you can write well, at least cogently and coherently. On the exams, bullet points, I'm just trying to get, do you got information? But part of being a pastor, and many of you who are training to be pastors, or whatever kind of ministry you're doing, is the ability to communicate well. And one of the ways to do that is by writing. So I would not be doing you a favor, or the people that you serve a favor, if we didn't at least aim for good communication skills in writing. I remember it wasn't in the PCA, but in my previous denomination, when men would be examined, and often as they were examined before the presbytery, they get nervous, and you account for some nerves, but sometimes they just were very inarticulate, and it was very clear that they didn't know their stuff. But all the ministers were really nice people and would feel bad. And so after he would leave the room and we'd talk about it. And inevitably, when someone gave a real clunker of an exam, a number of people would stand up and say, oh, I know him personally. He really knows his stuff. I've talked to him about it. He just doesn't speak well in front of people. And so I would be kind of a jerk and say, I know, he's a great guy. It's kind of what we're doing. It's kind of the profession we're entering into, is speaking in front of people. So all of you are here to learn things and communicate that to others. If you really are wondering about your writing or about your paper, you could even hand it in a couple weeks early. Usually 1 or 2 people in a class will do that, and say, Dr. DeYoung, would you take a look at this? And I can give you some feedback before the final date. I want you to be able to do the best that you can on this paper. So if you happen to be working ahead and you want some ways to edit and say, what do I need to do to make this better? Now, I'm hoping that all 40 of you don't do that, but if you do, I want to help you write the best paper that you can. You see the required reading there, self-explanatory, and you know the class rules about no computers in tablets. and taking notes. So one of the reasons I don't have people take notes, sometimes there's exceptions for learning things or other reasons, but one of the reasons I don't is because I am not trying to train you to be court stenographers. I'm not wanting you. Sometimes people will say, well, I can type a lot faster than I can write. That's true. I can get your notes more comprehensively if I'm typing than I'm writing. That's true. But I'm not interested in you reproducing my notes. If that's what I wanted, I could give you my notes. And I know every professor has a different philosophy, and some of them do that, and that's fine. But my approach is I want you listening, and I like eyeballs, and you'll write down things. And part of the active learning process is to be thinking and discerning, is this something that I think I need to know and I can jot down some notes? Because you have to be more discriminating when you can't just be cranking it out all the time. So there's my rationale for the class rules. My name is Kevin DeYoung. You can, I guess for this class, call me Dr. DeYoung, though that still feels sort of strange. My wife is very tired of the joke whenever a kid is sick, and she's of the, maybe you have that if you're married, my wife and her side of the family are very much, there's a sniffle, it might be cancerous, we should go to the doctor. My side, I don't know if it's like a Dutch or a Midwestern thing, but I kid you not, I mowed the lawn on a broken leg one time, and my mom said, "You're fine." So I don't ever send them, and so my wife is tired of all the times I say, "Honey, I am a doctor, so I think I can diagnose this." But you can call me Dr. DeYoung, I guess is fine. Let's press on then and do a little bit more before we take our halfway point break. So if you're taking notes, and most of you are, this section here in my notes is entitled The Centrality of Covenant. So centrality of covenant, that's what we want to talk about. No doubt, covenant is one of the most important, central, and unifying themes in the Bible. Some scriptural evidence. It is mentioned at least 300 times. Covenant is there at the Christmas story. It's there at the birth of John the Baptist. It's there in Luke 22 to explain the significance of his death. It's in Hebrews 8 to explain his high priestly work. Acts 3, the Jews were called the children of the covenant. And we'll have occasion throughout the class to look at many of these and many more occurrences. But it is, as I said, one of those words that's easy to just be a blip word on your brain and not realize that it's there at all of these turning points in redemptive history is the idea of covenant. Turretin, may his memory be forever blessed, says about the covenant of grace, quote, "Since it is of the greatest importance in theology, being as it were the center and bond of all religion, consisting in the communion of God with man, and embracing in its compass all the benefits of God towards man and his duty toward God, our highest interest lies in rightly knowing and observing it." Turretin says, in short, it's really, really important at the very heart of our religion. Here's another quote. "Our venerable grandsires were at home conversing upon the covenants. I love men who love the covenant of grace and base their divinity upon it. The doctrine of the covenants is the key of theology." Elsewhere, this same person talks about an old lady who was his cook at school. He said, "Many a time we have gone over the covenant of grace together, and I do believe that I learned more from her than I should have from any 6 doctors of divinity of the sort we have nowadays." So who said that? That great Baptist, Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon said, "I love men who love the covenant of grace. The doctrine of the covenants is the key of theology." Spurgeon was the one who said it was this old cook who taught him more than the doctors of theology nowadays. And that's important, as we'll see throughout this class and even later today. The covenant idea is in particular a central theme in Reformed and Presbyterian theology, but it has a very important place in Reformed Baptist understanding, and Charles Spurgeon exemplifies that. J.I. Packer says about covenant theology, he says this in his preface to, we'll come back to this name in a moment, Herman Vitzius, who has one of the seminal works on covenant theology in the 17th century. We'll come back to him. But J.I. Packer, in a long introduction to this book, says that covenant theology is a hermeneutic, that is a way of reading the whole Bible. Later in the course, there'll be a whole lecture on dispensationalism, and covenant theology and dispensationalism are really two opposite, though Christian, they're not antagonistic, but opposite ways of viewing Scripture. Now, in between, we're going to learn about some new kinds of covenant theology, progressive covenantalism, new covenant theology. But Packer's right. Covenant theology is not just a conclusion, but it is a whole way of viewing the Bible. And so just as if you talk to someone who was raised dispensational, probably some of you were. I have a lot of people at Christ Covenant who have dispensational background. I've been preaching through Revelation for 6 months, and you can tell the people who are, this is way different than I learned this book. Dispensationalism is not just a conclusion here. You can swap out conclusions. It's a different set of lenses for reading the Bible. Covenant theology is like that, Packer says. Biblical doctrine has to do with the covenantal relationships between God and man. Packer says biblical ethics have to do with our covenantal relationship with others, and the Christian religion has the nature of a covenant life. So God and man is a covenant relationship. Ethics is our covenant relationship, and your whole life is a covenant life. Packer says it is necessary for a proper understanding of the whole Bible. The gospel cannot be properly understood unless it is viewed through a covenantal frame. Now, lots of people can't articulate covenant theology, and they still love Jesus and know the gospel, so it's not that you can't be saved without this class. But to fully grasp all that is happening in the gospel, Packer says, you need to have covenant theology. The Word of God cannot be properly understood, and the reality of God cannot be properly understood apart from a covenantal frame. And then finally, he says, how does covenant theology, quote, force itself on all who read the Bible? Packer's arguing that once you have in your head this category of covenant, you begin to see that you really need to incorporate it into your whole reading of the Bible. He says, one, by the story it tells, by the place it gives to Jesus Christ in the covenant story, by the specific parallels between Adam and Christ as heads of a covenant people, and by the eternal covenant of redemption. All of that is Packer underscoring for us the centrality of this covenant idea. Next big heading. So that's first big heading for today. Here's the second. I want to talk about some words and definitions. Maybe, especially if this is your first seminary class, maybe saying, well, I've now heard this word about 100 times, and I'm yet not quite sure what we're talking about. What is a covenant? Let me give you a number of different definitions, and we'll siphon down to complex to simple. Heinrich Bullinger, the reformer, says a diatheke. I'm going to come back to this in some detail in a moment, but this is very important. Diatheke is the Greek word for covenant, and berit is the Hebrew word for covenant. And we'll talk in a bit about whether they mean the same thing or something different. The Latin words, which are also important, there's several of them. Fides, not fetus, but fides with a D, testamentum, and pactum. So Latin, you can see our word testament. Pactum, you can see our word pact. And then fides, from which we get our word federal. So covenant theology is sometimes called federal theology. Fides here meaning head. So federal or covenant theology has to do with different heads. Adam being the head of the human race, and Christ being the head of the redeemed people. So fides. So these are other words that are, so these are the Latin words. And then Greek, diatheke, Hebrew, berit. We're going to come back to these in a moment. But Bullinger says a diatheke is in the singular number signifies a pact and agreement and promise. Now that's a pretty simple, straightforward definition. A covenant, think a pact, an agreement, a promise. That at least gets us in the ballpark. So when you buy a house, assuming you're having to borrow money from the bank, you're going to sign some kind of contract, an agreement, a promissory note. They're loaning you this money at a certain interest. You have lots and lots of papers to sign. If you buy a car, when you get married, marriage is a covenant. You enter into a formal agreement or compact, and we'll spell that out in just a bit. Zachary Ursinus is a German reformer, Heidelberg, principal author of the Heidelberg Catechism, gives a more detailed definition: a mutual promise and agreement between God and men, in which God gives assurances to men that he will be merciful to them, and on the other side, men bind themselves to God in this covenant that they will exercise repentance and faith and render such obedience as will be acceptable to him. William Perkins says, a covenant is a compact made between God and man, touching reconciliation and life everlasting by Christ. Here's Vitzius. Here's his definition. He may win the prize for the hardest to understand. A covenant of God with man is an agreement between God and man, makes sense, agreement between God and man, about the way of obtaining consummate happiness, including, he uses these words which I don't use, commination, that is a threatening of divine punishment. So he says a covenant includes commination, a threatening of divine punishment, of eternal destruction, with which the contemner, come on, Vitzius, the contemner is someone who holds the way of salvation in contempt. So you can think of contempt, the person who holds something in contempt of happiness offered in that way is to be punished. In other words, Vitzius says, and bonus points for the alliteration, a covenant is a way towards consummate happiness, which threatens judgment upon the one who holds the way of happiness in contempt. So you see there, which will be important, the language of both promises and threats. Turretin defines covenant as, quote, a pact and agreement entered into between God and man, consisting partly in stipulation of duty and partly in the promise of reward. He says it can be described as a simple promise. It can be represented by symbols and sacraments. It can be described as an oath. Peter van Maastricht says a covenant denotes an agreement between God and his people in which God promises beatitude and stipulates obedience. So those are all old Reformation, post-Reformation definitions, but you hear some of the common language. So it's a pact, it's an agreement, there are promises, there's warnings, there's rewards, there are stipulations. So those are some of the common ideas in their definitions. Let's look at some more recent definitions, maybe a little easier to understand. John T. Rhodes, his book you're reading, and is an IPC pastor in the UK, says a covenant is a conditional promise. A conditional promise. Longer version, he says, a covenant is an agreement between God and human beings where God promises blessings if the conditions are kept and threatens curses if the conditions are broken. So a conditional promise, blessing if you keep the covenant, curses if you don't keep the covenant. One of the big issues in covenant theology is this matter on whether or not we are right to speak of conditions in the covenant. And John T. there puts it in his definition, and I agree with him, that the covenant has conditions, but some good Reformed theologians get nervous about that because condition then sounds like merit, works. You're saying there are things I need to do. So it's important to remember, a covenant can have conditions without stipulating that you have to keep all the conditions. So Christ will keep the conditions for us. But a covenant, by its very nature, I think John T. is right, is an agreement in which certain conditions must be met, certain things you must do. If you have, you and your friend agree to play basketball at 5 o'clock and meet there, and there's nothing that happens if you don't show up. There's nothing good that happens if you do show up. It's hardly a pact. It's hardly an agreement. It's more like just good intentions or wishful thinking. It's only when there is some threat of bad and some promise of good that we have a real agreement. The bank is going to loan you this money, and you sign this because they are making a promise to you that if you have a fixed interest rate, that's going to be your interest rate. They're promising that you can use this money, and you're making a promise that in a timely manner you will pay it back. And if you keep doing that, then you can pay down your house in a bazillion years. And if you don't, then bad things happen. The bank comes, takes it away. It's a pact with agreements. Dr. Belcher says, the word covenant refers to a legal agreement between two parties that is ratified by certain rituals that emphasize the binding nature of the agreement. So Dr. Belcher here gives us a new concept to put in with covenant, rituals. I don't think every covenant in life has to have rituals, but he's right that in the Bible, covenant arrangements typically have some sort of ritual that signifies or signs, gives a sign and a seal to that covenant. So for example, marriage, Malachi says marriage is a covenant. So as a covenant, how is the covenant union sealed? It's not a sacrament, at least Protestants don't believe it's a sacrament, but it has, you might say, lowercase s sacramental significance. So as a covenant, what is the ritual that enacts and binds that covenant? Well, Gordon Hugenberger in his book on Malachi is very good at showing this, that in the Old Testament and into the New Testament, a marriage is constituted really by two things, by an oath of solemn promise, and then by this sacred ritual, which in marriage is the act of sexual intercourse. And it is an act that is meant to have a unitive and procreative purpose, that the coming together of a man and woman is for that latent possibility. I know it doesn't always work that way, but it is with that latent possibility of having children, which is, as an aside, one of the reasons I think we ought to hold on to the definition that marriage is between a man and a woman. It's not just, well, that's Christian marriage, and then there's secular marriage. I know it's likely to be a losing battle in the West, but I think we should hold on to the words as long as we can. That marriage is by definition an act that has a unitive and procreative possibility, which by definition a same-sex union does not. Now, we have reproductive technology that outside forces can intervene, and those persons can still be pregnant or cause others to be pregnant, but the union of the two in themselves is not that kind of activity. So marriage is a covenant, and the ritual that binds and constitutes the marriage is that sexual activity. Why? Why does the minister say, "And now you may kiss the bride"? So the groom can just go, yeah, and give a really awkwardly long kiss that makes everyone okay, we get the idea. Well, I think it's because I haven't traced all the history of it, but best as I can tell, it's because that kiss is you're bearing public witness to the ritual enactment of that covenant marriage. Now, it actually used to be, you go back to the Middle Ages, Reformation times, that it was sometimes the duty of the best man or the bridal party to be in the room when the marriage was consummated, behind a sheet or something, to make sure the marriage took place. So I think a kiss, better idea. So it's not just hey, that's kind of nice. They get to do a kiss and that's fun. It's a symbolic way of saying we all bear public witness to this activity. We're going to trust that that's just a little foreshadow of the consummation of this relationship to come. But that ritual act is the sexual act that constitutes the covenant of marriage. And that makes sense why Jesus says that adultery is one grounds for divorce, because adultery is, by definition, a tearing asunder of the covenant relationship. You have signed the covenant document, as it were, on somebody else's covenant line. You have broken that covenant. You have constituted what ought not to be constituted. That's why that's so significant, and why that activity is what constitutes marriage and what allows, doesn't demand, but allows for divorce. So ritual, we see that in marriage, and we're going to see that in covenants throughout the Bible. J.I. Packer says, a covenant relationship is a voluntary, mutual commitment that binds each party to the other. And then O. Palmer Robertson, I didn't assign that book, Christ and the Covenants. Some of you have read it before or familiar with it. This is probably the most well-known, popular, contemporary definition. He says, a covenant is a bond in blood, sovereignly administered. O. Palmer Robertson, a bond in blood, sovereignly administered. Let's say something about each of those words. So it is a bond. It's a relational word. The binding together of parties in a covenant is by a verbal oath and or symbolic action. That's what I just said about marriage. That covenants tend to have a verbal oath and or some symbolic action. So even today, when you enter into an agreement, you have a symbolic action. You sign your name. Or if you really trust the person, it's more informal, you might do a handshake. There is something there to sign and to seal and authenticate you will be true to your promise. So it's a relationship bound by verbal oath and or symbolic action. As we'll see throughout the Bible, this often means eating a meal, setting up a memorial, sprinkling blood, offering a sacrifice, passing under a rod, dividing animals. Persons become committed to each other by covenant. And as we'll see in the weeks ahead, even this language, which we still have today, cut a covenant, or people might say, I'll cut you a deal. To cut a covenant is literally in the Old Testament because a covenant often involved the dividing of animals. We'll see this with Abraham in Genesis 15, and there's reference to the same practice in Jeremiah, and it's a Hittite practice of dividing the animals, tearing apart their carcasses as a symbolic representation. May it happen to me. May I be torn limb from limb if I'm not true to this covenant. So the covenant often involved the literal cutting of an animal. Or think about circumcision. The covenant of circumcision is the literal cutting away of the foreskin. So this language of cutting a covenant is very literal, and it even trickles down to us. Sometimes I'll cut you a deal. So there is a bond, a relational bond in blood. So we just saw that with the frequency of cutting. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins, Hebrews 9:22. Leviticus 17:11, life is in the blood. The shedding of blood represents a judgment on life. And then sovereignly administered. So God dictates the terms of the covenant. Bond, a relationship in blood, this ritual, often bloody symbolic action, sovereignly administered. So God is the one initiating the terms of the covenant. It's a pithy definition, which gets a lot of important elements: bond, blood, sovereign. My one hesitation with it is I think it's perhaps too precise in that there are examples of covenants in the Bible that don't involve blood, that have other symbolic representations, though often, and most importantly, they do. So give a little asterisk why perhaps a little too narrow, but it's a good definition. Here's my definition. A covenant is a promissory agreement between two parties. Just trying to put it very simply, a promissory agreement between two parties. That word, promissory, means there are blessings and curses. There are threatenings and there are stipulations. It's bound up in a web of promises and obligations. A promissory agreement. One other thing to say, just here under definition, and then we'll take a break. There's nothing to this that is infallible. Other people list it a different way. But I'd like you to think of 7 elements that are typically associated with covenants in the Bible. 7 elements, and I've worked hard to make these as easy to remember as possible. So I have 3 P words and 4 S words. So promises, seen that. Number 2, there are prescriptions. So there are certain things that you are told to do. And then there are penalties. If you could find a way to make them all S words, you could turn this into stipulations, and this into sanctions. So covenant has promises. I will do this for you. I will do this in obligation. Prescriptions, things you must do. Penalties, things that happen if you don't do them. Then, now I'm stretching a bit to try to get all the letters to line up. But there is a swearing, so some kind of, as we saw, verbal oath. Then there is a seeing. Yeah, it's a stretch, but you're witnessing some kind of action. So there's a seeing. This one was really written statements. And then, what's the last one? There are signs. So the seeing has to do with really the public nature of the bearing witness. Take the wedding analogy again. A covenant, there is a seeing. One of the reasons, I just wrote this 2 days ago, but it is one of the reasons that I would not advise someone to go to a gay wedding, because I think there is, in the nature of that, even if you know to yourself you don't agree with it and you've stated your disagreement with it, there is in the public nature of that ceremony a kind of seeing and almost sanctioning by your presence and by your witness to that event, which we know, and I hope you agree, as Bible Christians, we cannot give our sanction to. So promises, prescriptions, penalties, swearing, seeing, and then written statements. So there's documents, and then signs. The signs might be a rainbow or circumcision or bread and wine. These are 7 ways to think about. It's not that every covenant you come and you can just tick off, but it's, I think, a pretty good list of what we mean when we have a covenant relationship in the Bible. That it's more than just a, hey, you promise this, I promise that. There is a larger web of meaning to it. And one of the reasons, as we'll see throughout the class, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Or it might even be better titled an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. And so why do we have a New Testament? Because whenever when you have a major new covenant arrangement, you have new written statements. You have new documents pertaining to that covenant. And I think it was quite deliberate that the end of Revelation, especially if you take the later date, 90 AD, and John's the last apostle around, and he has some awareness that with his impending death, the end of the apostolic era is coming to a close, that he ends Revelation with very deliberate covenantal language. If anyone takes away from the words of these books, he will be taken away from the tree of life. If anyone adds to them. So that's the same language from Deuteronomy at the wrapping up the Mosaic covenant. Those are the warnings. Here are our covenant documents. Don't add to them. Don't subtract from them. And so Revelation, I don't think John just got up one day and said, today's a good day to write the last book in the Bible. So he's not thinking quite like that, but I do think he had an awareness. I have apostolic authority. I'm writing something that will be authoritative for the church. And as the last apostle, this is the close of an era. And so he thinks of it as wrapping up this new covenant literature in these documents. All right. Questions before I give you a 5-minute break? All right. Be back at 7:10. All right. Welcome back. We will jump back in so we can be done right on time. Over there in the blue are the 5 big headings in this first lecture. I don't think we'll get through all 5 of them, but centrality of the covenant, and we're here in words and definitions, and then we'll see how much of the rest we get through today. I want to come back under words and definitions now. We've spent some time with the covenant idea and various definitions, but I want to come back to these words, the Latin words, and in particular, diatheke and berit. So you will definitely need to know this on the midterm. Just what's the Greek word, what's the Hebrew word, maybe what's the Latin word. So good to know those things. Berit is the Hebrew word for covenant, diatheke, the Greek word. And part of the disagreement is it the Greek word for covenant or testament? Or are covenants and testaments overlapping, or are they very distinct ideas? And you can see there the Latin word testamentum, from which we get testament. We'll come back to that. Everett Ferguson notes that diatheke occurs in three main places in the New Testament. In the supper narratives, so the Lord's Supper and then the retelling of the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians. In Paul's discussion of the covenant in 2 Corinthians 3 and Galatians 4, and then in Hebrews 7 through 13. So diatheke, which is normally translated covenant in your English Bible, occurs a lot of places, but in those three main areas, the supper passages, 2 Corinthians 3, Galatians 4, where Paul's talking about Old and New Covenant, and then Hebrews 7 through 13, which we'll come to several times in this class, which is an extended discourse on the Old versus the New Covenant. The focus then is in explaining the death of Jesus, showing the relationship between the Old and New Testament, and proving the superiority of the Christian economy. The covenant idea is throughout the Bible, but in particular it helps to explain the death of Jesus, the relationship between the Old and the New, and the superiority of the New. The question, is diatheke tied to the Greek idea of testament or the Hebrew idea of covenant? You say, well, what might the difference be? Well, we just said a lot about covenants, a pact, an agreement, a promissory. Think about a testament. I don't know, do they still sell those in Christian bookstores, testaments, M-I-N-T, and you put the little mints? Yeah, they don't have Christian bookstores anymore, that's why. But a testament, think of a last will and testament. Somebody leaves a last will and testament. It is bequeathing to someone an inheritance that becomes operative upon the testator's death. So that's what we're talking about, the difference between a covenant and a testament. And so should we think of diatheke as the Hebrew idea of a covenant or this Greek idea of a testament? And an even further question is that idea even how the ancients understood a testament, the way we do as a last will and testament? But it's at least a shorthand for trying to understand the difference. Turretin says diatheke can refer to every covenant and agreement, but it particularly denotes a, quote, testamentary disposition with a federal agreement. He says the covenant of grace is both a testament and a covenant. So we are right to call it, quote, a covenant by a testament, or a testamentary covenant, or he says a federal testament. What is he saying there? So Turretin's saying diatheke, sometimes it's both of those things. It is always a covenant, but he says sometimes it's a testamentary covenant. That is, the promises of the covenant come to you in a testamentary fashion when the testator, the one who signed this last will and testament upon his death, is when you receive the promises and the inheritance. It's a covenant, Turretin says, because it's an agreement between parties. Because you think of a last will and testament. Your grandmother's going to leave you something when she dies. That's what she makes unilaterally, agreeing in law, stipulating. You don't make promises to her, typically. Maybe your grandma's like, you got to do this, this, and this, or you don't get it. But typically it's just, there it is, a bequeathal, a giving over of possessions. So it's a covenant, Turretin says, in that it's an agreement between parties with conditions and a mediator, but it's also a testament because, he says, there is an inheritance. The testator must die, and the execution of the agreement lands solely on the one making it, not on the heirs or the recipients of it. Say that again. The execution of the agreement lands solely on the one making it. So this is going to be executed because your grandma saved the money and she wrote this legally binding document that upon her death you receive your inheritance. It is not dependent upon the heirs or the recipients. So Turretin says the testamentary idea is principally urged in Hebrews 9:15. So turn there in Hebrews 9. If you've had your Greek class, quite all right. No requirement that you've had one, but if you do and you have your Greek Bible, you can also look at your Greek Bible in Hebrews 9:15. Hebrews 9:15, reading in the ESV, says, therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant. You can, if you have your Greek, it just says kai, dia, tuto, diathekes, kaines. And according to this, through this covenant, new covenant. So it's the word that we've been talking about, diatheke. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new diatheke, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal life, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed after the first covenant. Turretin, like many early Reformed theologians, says, this is clearly a covenant, but it has the testatory idea. And you can see why he says that. A mediator of a new covenant, and those who are called may receive. It's the language of inheritance. A death has occurred that redeemed them from the transgressions. So it fits with this idea of here's a type of covenant that's a testament. You receive this inheritance upon the death of the one who initiated the agreement, the execution of it. Vitzius, come back to him, says berith includes the idea of a testament, but properly speaking, it signifies a mutual agreement between parties. Still, he sees the testamentary idea often in the New Testament use of diatheke. So you have, if you're keeping score, you have Turretin, you have Vitzius, who say diatheke is a covenant, but sometimes it also includes this idea of a testament. However, many, maybe even most more recent Reformed theologians argue for a stronger discontinuity. Gerhardus Voss says berith never means a testament. The essential nature of a berith is in its unalterableness, its certainty, its eternal validity, and a testament, he says, is by nature changing. And I think he means there because it's brought into effect or execution upon the death of one. So it's alterable in that sense. So how should we think of it and how should we translate it? Well, the Septuagint, every time you mention the Septuagint, Will Ross gets $1. The Septuagint writers, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translate berith with diatheke. It seems that they did so because they didn't want to use this other word, which they could have used, suntheke. Suntheke, you see that this prefix, which often means together or with. So suntheke would have suggested some co-equality, some partnership in which each side was maybe doing its part. And so there's speculation that maybe they, in the Septuagint, they used diatheke instead of suntheke because they didn't want any confusion. They didn't want some kind of cooperation in the achievement of the covenant promises. Now, the King James translates diatheke in the New Testament as testament 14 times, and all the others as covenant. The RSV translates diatheke every time as covenant, except for Hebrews 9:16. So go back to your Bible. You may or may not realize this isn't a direct line, but the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, is deliberately in the tradition of the King James Version. And then later there was an NRSV, which did a lot of things that evangelicals didn't like and wasn't the same translation philosophy. So today the NRSV is usually only used in mainline denominations. You may not realize that the ESV is a deliberate retranslation of the RSV. So the RSV was a good translation. It did a few things that evangelicals really didn't like, and with good reason. So the biggest example is the translation of the word virgin in Isaiah, taking that out and making it young woman for theological reasons. So the RSV was never going to catch on. The ESV asked for permission to revise the RSV, and so the ESV is, I forget the exact percentage, but it's very much overlaps with the RSV, and the RSV is in the tradition with the King James. All that to say, the RSV then only one time translates diatheke not as covenant, and that's going to show up here in the ESV. So look at Hebrews 9:16. For where a will, now you say, what's that word? Well, verse 16 in the Greek, hopu gar diatheke, same word. Same word in verse 15 as in verse 16. Where a diatheke is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will, so here the ESV a second time translates it. And I have to go and check the RSV if that one time includes these two verses or not. But you see here verse 16 and 17. Same word. Verse 17 in the Greek, diatheke gar epi nekrois. Same word used in verse 15, 16, and 17. The ESV translates it a will in verse 16 and a will in verse 17. And then verse 18 goes back to, therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. So all around this discussion, covenant, here in verse 16 and 17, translates it as a will. So you say, well, is the ESV wrong? It depends. There are, what it's reflecting is this continuing debate. Now, words have a semantic range of meaning, and so it's not inappropriate that the same Greek word might be rendered with two different English words in different contexts. So the question really is, you can see the ESV thinks that in order to make sense of verse 16 and 17, that diatheke must have a testamentary. It must be a will and testament kind of covenant, even though it is still the word diatheke. So, to put a fine point on it, should Hebrews 9, 16, and 17 be seen as a last will and testament, which is how the ESV translates it? Let me give you some reasons for yes, some reasons for no. Here's some reasons for yes, for understanding, even though it's diatheke, that it's a testamentary idea. Well, we see that the death of the testator, again, not a word we use often, just the one who initiates the legal testament, the testator. The death of the testator is necessary for the testament to go into effect. We already saw that. Those may receive the promise of eternal life since a death has occurred. Verse 16, for where a diatheke is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a diatheke takes effect only at death. It certainly looks like, you can very easily conclude, that this is a testamentary idea. We are talking about something that is executed once the testator dies. Death is what initiates the execution of this testament. Many, including Calvin, favor testament. It does make the easiest sense of verses 16 and 17. So the ESV translates it as will, with this idea of a testament, and there's good historic theological reasons for doing that. On the other hand, why might this not be a testamentary idea? Well, one argument is to look at the broader context. And as I just said, the word in verse 15 is covenant, and then in 18, 19, 20, 21, see 20 again, this blood of the covenant, all these other references to covenant, it's all the same word. It's all diatheke. So you could certainly argue that that you would be right to want to translate that word the same in each of those verses rather than a different way in the middle in verse 16 and 17. So you could certainly make the case the burden of proof rests with those who want to make the middle verses a different word. Also, look at verse 17. For a will takes effect only at death. Well, that certainly seems to be the testament idea. A will is executed when the person who made it dies. But the word is, well, let me write it in English. The word is nekroi. Nekroi, if you've learned Greek, you can see that's plural. So the word translated death, nekroi, plural. So some argue you could say dead bodies. So a covenant takes effect at dead bodies, meaning that this is a reference to what I said before the break about dead animals, about the tearing apart limb from limb, that kind of a covenant idea. That the covenant takes effect is symbolically inaugurated not at the death of the testator, but at deaths, plural, dead bodies, meaning these animals. Also, the one making the covenant must die because he has sworn a maledictory oath against himself. So verse 17b then, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive, could be thought of as a kind of symbolic death. So God walks between the animals. We'll see in Genesis 15, a fire pot, smoke and fire, that's a theophany. So God walks between them. And dead here then refers to dead animals. And it's the testator, when he's alive, is thinking in a symbolic sense that the Lord walking through those animals is a kind of symbolic death. Now, one argument against this view is it does require 17a to be literal death, 17b to be a kind of symbolic sacramental sign of death. But that's the argument. A further argument against the testamentary idea, and I think D.A. Carson said this when he taught Hebrews here a few years ago. He argued that what we think of as a will and testament is our own idea, but that's not how a will and testament worked in the ancient world. That's for others to investigate, but there's certainly a plausible case to be made. There's also another option to think that the covenant here that's broken is the Mosaic covenant. That's what's talking about the death of the Mosaic covenant, which is a nice alternative because the rest of the chapters are about the superiority of the new covenant to the old covenant, but it's a little bit of shoehorning into these specific verses. So what's the answer? Well, I will say this. O. Palmer Robertson, mentioned earlier, is especially adamant that we should not confuse the two concepts. Chancellor Ligon is also very strong on this, and covenant theology is his thing, and he's read all the literature very well. So most newer Reformed theologians are very strong in saying, no, the covenant idea and the testamentary idea are different, and diatheke is bereith. We should think of diatheke everywhere as bereith. We're talking about an Old Testament covenant idea. So I try to split the difference. I feel myself torn between Robertson and Duncan and lots of other people, but I mean, Turretin, he counts for something too, and Calvin. So it's not that we just weigh authorities, but it is to say this is an important issue, and yet one part of wisdom is to say, well, if the tradition has not spoke uniformly about this, doesn't mean we just toss up our hands, but it does mean we have to hold our opinions somewhat and our convictions somewhat loosely. Trying to split the difference, I would say that both a covenant and a testament relate to death, but the difference, of course, we can see in a covenant, that death stands at the beginning, and in a testament, it stands at the end. Now, in a covenant, it's at the beginning symbolically. You're not really dead, but circumcision points to the cutting away of the flesh. Baptism even has an undercurrent of curse. The floodwaters sweep is mainly about cleansing and forgiveness, but I'm convinced Meredith Klein's right that there's also an undercurrent of... So covenants typically have some kind of symbolic action of death or potential cursing at the front end, where a testament is death executed at the end. But in both, death is presumed. In testament, however, it's there essential to the execution of it, whereas in a covenant, avoiding death is the idea, that I set before you life and death. Christ's death is certainly to be understood mainly in terms of a covenant. It was a substitutionary sacrifice for covenant breakers. We're going to get to the Westminster Confession if we have time, because the Westminster Confession, this is why I also don't want to make too fine a point on it. The Westminster Confession also overlaps the covenant idea and the testament idea. So at the very least, say mainly what bereith, well, bereith is covenant, mainly diatheke in the New Testament. Mainly we're looking at this Old Testament Hebraic covenant idea, promissory agreement. But might there also be the testamentary notion of one who dies and then upon his death gives an inheritance? I, for one, think that there is some of that testamentary idea. And so I don't think the ESV has to use the word will in verse 16 and 17, but I don't think it's wrong to do so. So the main idea is clearly covenant in the Hebraic sense of a relational compact, but I don't think we have to limit the word from ever having that overlapping testamentary idea. Yes?
You mentioned earlier when Carson came here and taught Hebrews that you said there was a difference between our understanding of testament and will and how that would overlap with them, but a lot of the language you're using, like just in the past 5 sentences, sounds very Western. So is that is it just very fine points, and actually when someone died, that's the same now?
It's good. Did anyone take Carson's Hebrews class? Gene, what do you remember? How? No? Okay. Again, far be it for me to think that the Don was wrong. I haven't traced his argument to know if it is a fine nuance or eliminates all of this. All right, moving on to history of covenant theology. Many have said that it is a particularly Reformed doctrine, and we'll see some ways that that's true, but I also want to make the case that it has been around from the very beginning. It's always important. It was critical to the Reformers. Their argument was, in fact, that the Church of Rome had departed from the tradition, that the Church of Rome in the 16th century had accumulated all of these barnacles from the medieval church-state synthesis and corruption of the papacy. The Reformers were always wanting to show, no, we are not trying to say something new. So we do take that seriously. Is this just a Reformed idea, or has it been around? Certainly, to be fair, it has received much greater attention and definition in Reformed theology, but it does figure in the early church. Figures prominently in the Epistle of Barnabas, in Justin Martyr, in Irenaeus, in Clement of Alexandria, in Augustine. Andrew Woolsey, Woolsey, you don't need to know his name, but he has a big dissertation on history of covenant theology, and he helpfully points out where some of this continuity. He says, in the patristics, in the church fathers, the early centuries, they used the covenant idea to stress unity and to explain the discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments. They talk about salvation as one eternal covenant in Christ unfolding in time. They emphasize the unilateral promise of grace that requires a response of faith and obedience, but this response requires divine enabling. Augustine develops covenant in a legal sense, and Augustine connects covenant with baptism. So just to play some, won't be the last time I play a few Presbyterian cards here for you to look at. I know that one of the arguments that my good Baptist friends make is, okay, you say that infant baptism has been around for most of church history. And they'll say, well, that's true. Okay, we kind of debate the first couple centuries, but pretty much everyone agrees, at least from the 3rd century, it's infant baptism. So my Baptist friends will say, yes, but why did they baptize infants? They baptized them because of a belief in baptismal regeneration, or that it washed away original sin, or baptism conferred justification, and that's not why you Presbyterians are baptizing. I say it's true. So I say, okay, people were baptizing. I grant you that's not new, but your theology upon which you're baptizing is new. I'm trying to summarize what I think my Baptist friends would say. And I do think we have to look at that squarely and say, yeah, the Westminster Confession of Faith is not just pulled out from Tertullian or from Justin Martyr. And yes, in many parts of the early church, medieval church, they're thinking of infant baptism in these sacerdotal ways. However, my response would be, it's not completely foreign that baptism is linked to the covenant idea. And you see it in Augustine, and the covenant theology is particularly prominent in the church father Irenaeus. Irenaeus is sometimes called the first covenant theologian. He understood diatheke primarily as a relational term describing God's interaction with his people. He understood it as covenant rather than the transfer of an inheritance or a gift. So again, back to that covenant idea versus will or testament. Irenaeus said, no, this is really mainly about a relational compact or agreement. True, covenant theology was not prominent in medieval theologians, but Doug Kelly, who used to teach here, argues that the covenant idea, especially as it relates to the plan of salvation, and executed by the triune God was a foundation for theologians like Lombard and Aquinas in the Middle Ages. So Doug Kelly is saying, yeah, you don't find explicit covenant theology, but this idea that there's intra-Trinitarian agreement to accomplish and execute our salvation, that is a covenant idea, and that's at the very foundational level for key figures in medieval theology. So we don't want to overstate the case, but we don't want to be ignorant and think that covenant theology just sprang up de novo, out of nowhere, out of the head of John Calvin. So, to the Reformation. Covenant theology grew out of Swiss soil. It's there in Zwingli, who's a full generation before Calvin. The first to write a Reformed treatise on the subject, I can't remember if I have this in the test, but it seems like a good fact to know, is Heinrich Bullinger, the first to write a full treatise on covenant theology. He's the successor to Zwingli, entitled Of the One and Eternal Testament or Covenant of God. So the first to write, I should say, a Reformed treatise is Heinrich Bullinger in the 16th century. So Zwingli, Bullinger, and then, of course, John Calvin. John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. And then Beza, who is, so Bullinger, after Zwingli, and then Calvin, his successor is Beza. They all have the covenant idea. If somebody asks, well, was Calvin a covenant theologian? On one hand, you could say no, he did not make it the key to his system. It's not his central dogma. It's not his overarching structure. He did not talk about a covenant of works explicitly or a covenant of redemption. But more importantly, yes, he was a covenant theologian. The basic ideas are present. The covenant of works may not be articulated by Calvin, but it's anticipated by him. The covenant idea is woven throughout his theology and in his sermons. It formed a vital part of his theological structure. He took all the points by Zwingli, by Bullinger, and expounded them in more detail. So you see it in the Institutes in particular, where he talks about unity and discontinuity of the covenant. When he talks about the harmony of the law and gospel, he talks about the unilateral and the bilateral significance of the covenant, and he relates covenant to the visible church and then the invisible church of the elect. So we'll come back to many of those terms. But Calvin certainly has many of the key ideas in his theology. So from the Swiss cantons to Germany, key development is in Zachary Ursinus and Caspar Livianus. They're students of Calvin at Geneva, and then Peter Martyr Vermigli. They further develop this in Germany and in the Palatinate, which is where Heidelberg was. And then in the 19th century, German theologian, the name of Hepp, Heinrich Hepp, 1820 to 79. You probably haven't heard of him, and that's okay, but he was important in the understanding of the history of covenant theology. Another Heinrich. Johannes Heppe. That sounds peppy. Okay. Heinrich Heppe argued that the German Reformed theology was actually a rejuvenation of Melanchthon's theology. Now, Melanchthon works alongside with Luther, sort of a half generation later. So Hepp's argument is that this covenant theology is not really Reformed in its genesis, but was really Lutheran. This has been, I think, disproved by Peter Lilbeck, president at Westminster. This was his dissertation and others. He shows convincingly that federalism, this covenant idea, is intrinsic to Reformed theology. Now, it's fine. We don't have to get into, who came first with Reformed and Lutheran, but I do think he's right. And we'll see in a moment why this view of Heinrich Heppe has some legs to it. Ursinus had been a pupil of Melanchthon, but it was from Calvin and Bullinger and Peter Martyr Vermigli that he became Reformed and learned about covenant theology. So that's a key part of the argument, is Ursinus. Ursinus is the principal author of the Heidelberg Catechism. And the argument is, did he get his ideas from Melanchthon? Or did he get it mainly from Calvin and other Reformed? And Lilbeck argues mainly from Calvin. After the Reformation, the idea of covenant theology, like so many wonderful things in life, owe their blessings to the Dutch. I can say, since anyone else Dutch in here? That's right. What's your last name again?
It's not Dutch radio.
Oh, who is Nykirk? Isn't that a good?
That's me.
Yeah? No?
I think so.
Yeah, good. We'll claim it. If you ain't Dutch,
You ain't much.
that's true. You ain't much. So, 3 key Dutch figures. First, and look, this first lecture for those of you, especially your first class, and these names are going by fast, I know, and just get some of the basic contours. You don't have to, the exam's not going to tell you to give much of a rundown on these. Just need to get a lay of the land here. Johannes, how would you pronounce this? Some say Coxius, some Cochius. So Johannes Coxius, 1603 to 1669. He writes the book, The Doctrine of the Covenant and Testament of God. Coxius is often called the father of federal theology, but he should really be credited with bringing together what already existed in various bits and forms. So his work is from 1648, but there's some other important works. So for one thing, you have the Westminster Confession of Faith, 1646, 1647, so that's earlier. You also have the Marrow of Modern Divinity, which would prove to be a very consequential book a couple generations later in Scotland, but that book dates to 1645. So when Cochius writes his book on the Treatise of Covenant Theology, he already has the Westminster Confession of Faith, Marrow of Modern Divinity. So again, he's not saying something that hadn't been said before, but he is bringing together these various strands. In one sense, covenant theology, you could say he's the father of biblical theology. So when you say biblical theology, do you just mean theology from the Bible? No, biblical theology as a specific discipline refers to a theological method that traces the redemptive storyline of Scripture. So, for example, an exegetical theology is sort of what you get in the church most Sundays, verse by verse, exposition. Here's what these paragraphs, these verses. Systematic theology is when a particular topic of Scripture, say the crucifixion, the atonement, the two natures of Christ, the Trinity, covenant, take a topic, systematize it. What does the whole Bible say? What we mean by biblical theology is let's trace this idea. So Coxius, in some ways, is the first one to do biblical theology. In contemporary vein, it usually goes to Gerhardus Voss, another Dutchman, transplant to America. his book, Biblical Theology, teaching at Princeton Seminary, the beginning of the 20th century. So biblical theology says, let's look at the idea of the temple. Oh, there's a temple in the garden, and then there's a tabernacle, and then there's a temple in Solomon's day, and then Jesus is the new temple, and then the new heavens and new earth are like a temple come down. So you trace the idea throughout the Bible. So Coxius, in doing covenant theology, is a kind of biblical theologian. Let's trace these ideas, the unfolding promises of God. He traded the typical scholastic method, which was very much still in vogue at the time. So those of you who have to read Turretin is really a high point of Protestant scholastic theology. Lots of fine definitions, lots of philosophical terms, where Coxius does something different and replaces that scholastic method with what we might call today a contextual, historical, biblical theology. And then, the name that I've given you already several times, Hermann Witsius, his book, The Economy of the Covenants. The Economy of the Covenants from 1685. Again, you can get the 2 volumes of this. RHB published them. J.I. Packer has a nice introduction. And it's not the easiest to read. It's in squint print, but this is another classic text on covenant theology. And then finally, third Dutchman, Wilhelmus Abrakel, in his The Christian's Reasonable Service, which RHB also published. You can get the 4 volumes of it, and covenant theology is riven throughout there. His systematic theology, I forget the exact date. I think it's right around 1700. So Hepp, who I had up there earlier, Heppe, one of the reasons he became significant is he argued that, so you say, why was Hepp, other than being German, why did he want to argue that covenant theology was really German, and Lutheran rather, in its origination? Well, part of what he was trying to do is he was trying to say covenant theology was like softening Calvinism. Calvinism was very harsh and logical and made central predestination, reprobation. And so Hepp's argument was, no, covenant theology started out Lutheran, and the Reformed adopted it because they saw that this Calvin predestination theology needed to be softened with something more relational and full of promises and life. That basic understanding also gets matriculated to a famous American historian, maybe you've heard of, Perry Miller, writing 50s and 60s and writing about the Puritans and about Jonathan Edwards, and really a brilliant historian, still worth reading, even though he got some things really wrong. But Perry Miller famously argued that the New England Puritans also emphasized covenant theology because they wanted to tame the excesses of Reformed dogma. So that's why these arguments trickle down and become important. Is covenant theology something to correct Reformed theology? Or, as I've been arguing, no, it's there in Zwingli, it's there in Bullinger, it's there in Calvin. It grows up out of this Reformed theology. Gerhardus Voss argued that the very first real statement of covenant theology comes from the Westminster Confession of Faith. And we have run out of time to look at that, so that will be our cliffhanger for next week to pick up with a quick overview of covenant theology in the Westminster Confession of Faith. We'll get to this idea of covenant renewal, and then we'll move our way into the deep end of the theological pool. Oh, we've just been waiting around this week, and talk about the covenant of redemption. So, see you next week.